Nathan Cole walked into the Ashford Regency Gala as the only man alive who could save the biggest acquisition in the company's history. But the chief executive, Vivian Ashford, looked at him and saw only a tired gray suit, a modest watch, and the quiet fact that he was raising a daughter alone. In front of hundreds of guests, she swapped his seating card and sent him down to the staff dining room like a delivery driver who had wandered into the wrong hallway. Nathan did not argue. He simply sat among the people the room had trained itself not to see. Then a door opened. Margaret Ashford, the woman whose name was on the building, pulled out the chair beside him and said 4 words that made the entire ballroom go silent, and by morning nothing about Ashford Regency would ever look the same again. 10 hours before the gala began, Nathan arrived at the glass tower that housed Ashford Regency Hospitality for what he had been told was the final meeting on the Summit Resorts acquisition, a deal worth well over $1 billion that would fold an aging chain of resorts into the Ashford portfolio. The insurance underwriters had made their position clear months earlier. Without certification from Cole Systems Engineering, the small engineering firm Nathan had built after his wife died, none of the outdated resort properties could be legally insured for reopening. His patented system, known internally as Guardian Grid, was the only technology capable of retrofitting the resort's failing electrical grids without shutting the buildings down for a full year of renovation. Ashford Regency needed him more than anyone in that building was willing to admit out loud. They kept him waiting outside the boardroom for nearly 40 minutes while junior executives walked past without a glance, none of them bothering to ask who he was or why he was sitting so patiently in the hallway. When he was finally shown in, Vivian did not offer him a chair right away. She studied the suit he had owned for years, the kind that had been pressed and repaired rather than replaced, and asked her assistant loudly enough for Nathan to hear whether contractors were typically permitted into board-level meetings. Nathan reminded her, without raising his voice, that Ashford Regency itself had invited him as the independent certifying engineer on the deal. Vivian finally slid a revised contract across the table, one that would buy out his patents for a fraction of their worth, while requiring him to sign off on the resort's safety before repairs were even finished, with a buried clause that would let the company quietly release its longtime maintenance staff once the ink dried. Nathan read it twice and set it back down without picking up a pen. Vivian told him plainly that a company as small as his did not have the leverage to stand against Ashford Regency, and suggested he think about his daughter's tuition before trying to play the hero. It was the first time all morning her contempt had found something personal to aim at. Yet Nathan's expression barely changed. He told her he had raised his daughter on honest work and he would not use her future as a reason to put thousands of hotel guests at risk. Vivian smiled the way people smile when they believe they have already won, and invited him to the evening's gala, telling him he still had a few hours to reconsider where exactly he stood. As he left the room, Bradley Kane, the chief financial officer, asked what would happen if Nathan refused to sign, and Vivian answered without hesitation that by nightfall the man would understand what it felt like to stand completely alone. The elevator down to the lobby was lined with mirrored glass, and Nathan caught his own reflection multiplied a dozen times as the doors closed. A tired man in a well-worn suit, surrounded by a building built entirely of surfaces designed to remind visitors how small they were. He thought, not for the first time, that people who grew up inside buildings like this one often mistook the height of the ceilings for the size of their own judgment. Outside, the wind off the harbor cut through the plaza, and he stood for a moment beneath the Ashford Regency sign, letting the cold clear his head before he reached for his car keys. He had learned years earlier, in the months after his wife's diagnosis, that anger rarely won anything on its own, and that the men and women who controlled rooms like the one he had just left counted on people like him losing their composure first. He was not going to give Vivian that satisfaction. Not today, and certainly not over a contract that asked him to trade his name for her convenience. Nathan drove back to the modest second-floor office of Cole Systems Engineering, tucked above an old repair shop on the edge of the city, a space that could not have looked more different from Ashford Regency's marble lobby. The walls were covered not with awards, but with technical drawings, patent certificates, and handwritten thank you notes from fire departments, hospitals, and hotels that had trusted his system when it mattered most. His phone rang before he had even set down his bag. It was his daughter, Mia, calling to ask whether he was still planning to attend the gala that night. He did not tell her that Vivian had used her tuition as leverage that morning. He only said the evening might decide the future of the company. Mia, sharper than most 20-year-olds have any right to be, reminded him that after her mother died, he had turned down a lucrative position rather than leave her alone, and told him gently that he no longer needed to sacrifice his principles to keep protecting her. The call was brief, but it grounded him, reminding him exactly why the fight in front of him mattered. After he hung up, Nathan sat for a while in the quiet of the office, listening to the radiator tick against the cold coming through the old window frames. The building smelled faintly of solder and coffee, a scent he had come to associate with every late night he had spent rebuilding his life after his wife passed, teaching himself to be both parent and provider without complaint. He kept a small photograph on his desk, curled slightly at the corners, of Mia at 8 years old, standing beside the first prototype sensor he had ever soldered together in this very room. It reminded him, on nights like this one, that the company had never been about proving anything to men like Bradley Kane or women like Vivian Ashford. It had always been about building something honest enough that his daughter would never have reason to doubt the kind of man her father had chosen to be. Before leaving the office, Nathan pulled up the digital archive where Cole Systems Engineering had filed its safety assessments and found that 3 critical warning reports submitted to Ashford Regency had simply vanished from the shared portal. The documents Bradley had forwarded to the insurance underwriters carried the same file numbers but different language, with severe electrical hazards quietly downgraded to routine maintenance suggestions. Nathan understood then that the gala was never meant to be a negotiation. It was meant to be a stage, a place where Vivian could surround him with wealth and power until he felt small enough to sign whatever was placed in front of him. He decided to attend anyway, not to beg for a deal, but to watch closely and see who in that boardroom already knew the truth behind the altered files. He copied every original document onto an encrypted drive and sent a duplicate to his attorney before locking the office for the night, common the certainty that the truth, once written down, does not disappear as easily as a file on a shared server. Across town, in Ashford Regency's grand ballroom, Vivian instructed the event coordinator to seat Nathan among the minor vendors near the back rather than at the strategic partners table where the deal's most important signatures would gather. Bradley suggested cutting him from the guest list altogether, but Vivian wanted Nathan to witness the full weight of the company's power up close, certain the sheer scale of it would remind him exactly how small his firm truly was. She believed, the way people often believe right before they are proven wrong, that opulence alone could bend a man's judgment. Meanwhile, Margaret Ashford, Vivian's mother and the quiet co-founder of the company that still bore her late husband's name, placed an unexpected call to her personal assistant and asked for confirmation of a single name on that evening's guest list, Nathan Cole. That evening, the grand lobby of Ashford Regency filled with investors, local officials, minor celebrities, and executives dressed for a night meant to celebrate a billion-dollar milestone. Nathan arrived alone in a charcoal suit, understated against the sea of designer gowns and tailored jackets, and the young woman at the check-in table looked at his name twice before believing he belonged among the strategic guests. A few executives recognized him, but avoided eye contact entirely, having already been told by Vivian's office that he was a difficult vendor attempting to inflate his price at the worst possible moment. Renee Park, the longtime banquet manager who had worked events at Ashford Regency for nearly 2 decades, was the only person who greeted him by name and personally walked him into the main hall. The ballroom itself seemed to shimmer, chandeliers throwing pale gold light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Somewhere near the string quartet, the scent of lilies mixed with expensive perfume and warm bread. Nathan moved through it all with the quiet detachment of a man who had learned long ago that rooms like this one were built to be admired, not trusted, and that the people inside them often confused comfort for character. He noticed how conversations paused slightly as he passed, not with recognition, but with the polite confusion of guests trying to place a face that did not match the room's usual guest list. It did not bother him. He had stopped needing rooms like this to confirm his worth many years earlier, somewhere between a hospital waiting room and the first night he had put his daughter to bed alone. On their way through the service corridor, Nathan noticed an emergency exit partially blocked by a rolling cart loaded with dinnerware, and without a word of complaint, he helped Renee move it aside. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had filed a report about that exact obstruction months earlier and had never received so much as an acknowledgement. Nathan began to understand that the way Ashford Regency treated its own staff was really a mirror of how it treated every uncomfortable warning. Anything that did not look pleasant simply got pushed out of view. His name had originally been placed at table 2, seated beside the insurance representative and the deal's lead counsel, exactly where a man carrying the fate of a billion-dollar contract should sit. Only minutes before guests began taking their seats, Vivian's assistant swapped his place card for that of a major investor, moving Nathan down to table 14, near the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. Vivian walked past his short while later in feigned surprise at finding him there, telling him with practiced ease that the head table was reserved for people who had truly contributed to the company's future. Nathan replied without raising his voice that no future could be built on reports that had already been rewritten. Vivian's tone sharpened instantly as she warned him not to bring business talk into a celebration, and he asked her plainly whether she had ever read the original safety reports or only the versions Bradley had handed her. For one brief second, something in her composure flickered, though she covered it quickly with the same cool detachment she wore like armor, still convinced that Nathan was simply exaggerating in hopes of raising his price. Before stepping onto the stage, she turned to the head of guest relations and gave one final quiet instruction: make certain Nathan Cole did not appear in a single photograph that night. Just before the appetizers were served, Derek Sloan, the insurance company's senior representative, arrived and asked to be seated beside Nathan so they could review the certification paperwork together. Vivian realized then that pushing him to the back of the room had not been enough to keep him away from the people who actually mattered to the deal's outcome. She walked directly to table 14 in front of a room full of guests, announced there had been a seating error, and claimed the table had been reserved for investors after all, instructing Nathan to move to the staff dining room behind the kitchen instead. Renee tried to explain that Nathan's name was clearly listed among the confirmed guests, but Vivian cut her off and asked sharply whether she still wanted to keep her position. Then she turned back to Nathan, smiling for the benefit of everyone close enough to hear, and said that a man who built systems for the people who worked hotels might feel more at home eating with them instead. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through nearby tables while others looked down at their plates, unwilling to challenge a chief executive in the middle of her own celebration. Vivian expected Nathan to raise his voice, to give her the excuse she needed to paint him as unprofessional and quietly remove him from the deal entirely. Instead, he picked up his place card, looked at her steadily, and asked whether she wanted him gone because he did not matter, or because she was afraid of what he might say if he stayed. Vivian answered only that the people who truly needed him at the head table were already seated there. Nathan did not argue further. He thanked Renee, rose from his chair, and walked toward the staff area through a silence that had settled over the entire room like a held breath. Bradley was certain, watching from across the ballroom, that Vivian had just won. The staff dining room could not have been more different from the hall Nathan had just left. Fluorescent light replaced chandeliers, and the walls were bare except for a faded shift schedule taped beside the door and a corkboard cluttered with birthday cards and a lost and found notice. The smell here was simpler: two roasted chicken and brewed coffee rather than lilies and champagne, and somehow the room felt more honest for it. Nathan was welcomed with folding chairs, simple plates, and a group of employees stealing a quick meal between shifts, none of whom cared about his net worth, his title, or what car he drove. Renee apologized for failing to protect him, and Nathan told her plainly that she had nothing to apologize for, and that sharing a meal with working people had never once been something to be ashamed of. He set his jacket over the back of his chair, rolled up his sleeves, and helped an older employee open a stubborn bottle of water, and slowly the tension in the room began to ease. Marcus Reyes, a maintenance technician who had spent years keeping the hotel's aging systems running, spotted the Cole Systems engineering logo on Nathan's folder and asked whether he was the engineer who had once written a report on the basement electrical system. Nathan confirmed that he was, and Marcus explained that the report had triggered a wave of concern among 3 separate managers before quietly disappearing from the company database weeks later. He revealed that he had kept his own copies of the original maintenance logs all along, out of a quiet fear that someday the blame for a failure no one had fixed would land on the workers who had warned about it first. Then Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Nathan a photograph he had saved for months, an image of Bradley Kane's own signature approving a note that read, in plain language, "Delete before the assessment." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the images, not from fear of Nathan, but from years of frustration finally finding somewhere to land. He explained that he had raised the basement wiring issue 3 separate times through proper channels, each time watching his concerns get quietly folded into paperwork that made the danger sound smaller than it actually was. He had a wife at home and 2 grown sons who worked construction, and he had told himself for years that speaking up too loudly would only cost him a pension he had spent 2 decades earning. Nathan listened without interrupting, the way he always did when someone finally found the courage to say something they had swallowed for far too long. And he told Marcus plainly that no report should ever have to survive that many rewrites to be believed. Inside the ballroom, Vivian began her keynote about the Ashford family, insisting that every employee was the true heart of the company. The kind of polished sentiment that sat uneasily against the fact that she had just sent a certifying engineer to eat with the staff and threatened a loyal manager in the same breath. Margaret Ashford arrived late without warning her daughter and stood near the back of the hall just in time to catch the tail end of the moment. When she learned that Nathan had been moved to the staff dining room, she did not walk toward the head table that had been prepared in her honor. Instead, she crossed the ballroom, pushed open the service door, and stepped into the small room behind the kitchen, where Nathan sat among the people who kept Ashford Regency running every single day. Vivian, still mid-speech, glanced at a nearby monitor and saw her mother's image appear on the internal security feed, standing in a room that was never meant to hold anyone important. Margaret did not ask a single person to stand or make way for her. She simply pulled out a folding chair beside Nathan and asked, in a voice that carried further than she probably intended, whether there was still room at that table for people who told the truth. For a long moment, nobody in that cramped room moved at all. Renee stood frozen with a tray still balanced against her hip, and Marcus set down his fork mid-bite, watching the founder of Ashford Regency settle into a folding chair as though it were the most natural seat in the entire building. Margaret smoothed her skirt once, the way a woman does when she is fully aware of the picture she has just made and does not intend to apologize for it. A member of the event's media team, trailing Margaret out of habit, captured the moment on a phone, and within minutes the image had spread quietly through the crowded ballroom, guest to guest, whisper to whisper. Nathan realized only then that Margaret was the same woman who had hired Cole Systems Engineering 3 months earlier for an independent safety review, working under her maiden name, Margaret Bennett, precisely because she had already suspected the company's internal reports were not what they seemed. She had not wanted to alarm her daughter without proof, so she had waited quietly for the truth to surface on its own terms. Nathan had never connected the two names, and understood in that instant that he had not been invited to the gala by accident. Margaret herself had placed him on the strategic partners list. Diane took notes quickly, occasionally glancing up at Margaret to gauge her reaction, while Derek nodded along, clearly satisfied that a workable path now existed where none had seemed possible an hour earlier. The cost was significant, but nowhere near what the company would lose if the entire acquisition collapsed outright. Vivian objected, worried the delay would rob her of the triumphant announcement she had planned for the press, and Margaret asked her quietly but without softness whether she wanted to save the company or simply save her own image. Before the meeting could move forward, Nathan raised a concern that made the room fall silent again. Portions of the Guardian Grid interface had already appeared in Ashford Regency's internal materials, despite the fact that he had never issued a license for its use. Bradley had quietly hired an outside consulting firm to replicate the visual interface of Nathan's system for a private investor demonstration, a shell version that displayed convincing alerts on a screen without ever connecting to real sensors in the buildings themselves. Vivian had watched that very demonstration weeks earlier and had walked away believing Ashford Regency no longer needed Nathan at all, which explained the confidence behind every dismissive word she had aimed at him that night. Bradley tried to shift blame onto the subcontractor, but digital signatures and a clear payment trail proved he had personally approved the imitation system from start to finish. Vivian realized, with a slow and uncomfortable clarity, that Bradley had spent months feeding her own arrogance, convincing her that Nathan was merely a vendor chasing a bigger paycheck while he quietly buried evidence of his own fraud. Margaret refused to let her daughter cast herself entirely as a victim in the unfolding mess, reminding her that Bradley may have lied, but Vivian was the one who had chosen to trust a flatterer over the man who had brought her uncomfortable truths from the very beginning. Vivian stood very still for a moment, watching Bradley gather his things under the quiet supervision of building security, and something in the sight of it unsettled her more than she expected. She had trusted him for nearly a decade, had promoted him twice, had defended him once in front of the very board that was now voting to remove him. It occurred to her, standing in that fluorescent-lit room, that she had never once asked Bradley to show her the raw data behind his numbers, only the polished version that always seemed to arrive exactly when she needed good news. She had mistaken his confidence for competence, and now she was beginning to wonder how many other decisions she had made the very same way. Vivian asked to speak with Nathan alone, and in the corridor outside, she offered to triple the value of his original contract if he would sign a temporary certification before midnight, promising the real repairs would follow quietly afterward. Nathan refused without hesitation. She shifted quickly to threats, warning that Ashford Regency had more than enough attorneys to keep Cole Systems Engineering tied up in litigation for years. Nathan remained unmoved, telling her that copies of every document had already gone to his attorney that afternoon, and that the insurance company had received formal notice to preserve all related evidence. Vivian's voice had lost the polish it carried earlier that evening, and for the first time all night, Nathan saw something closer to a frightened executive than a woman certain of her own power. She glanced back toward the ballroom doors as if the crowd behind them might somehow rescue her from a conversation she no longer controlled. There was no longer a way for her to buy him, threaten him, or isolate him into submission, and something in her expression finally cracked under the weight of that realization. Nathan told her, without cruelty but without softening the truth either, that she had assumed he was weak because he arrived alone that night, yet she herself had stood in a room full of hundreds of people and still could not find a single person willing to tell her the truth. When they returned to the main gathering, Derek informed the room that the certification deadline could not be extended, and if Nathan did not sign, the entire acquisition announcement would have to be cancelled on the spot. Nathan formally declined to sign, and from the ballroom beyond the doors, Vivian could hear the master of ceremonies beginning to introduce what he still believed would be a historic announcement, a triumph she now knew no longer existed. She was forced to walk back onto the very stage where she had planned to celebrate the largest deal of her career, and instead tell the room that the announcement would be postponed while the company reviewed certain technical conditions more carefully. Camera flashes that had been waiting all evening for a triumphant photograph instead caught the flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, a small human crack in a night built entirely around the appearance of control. Investors immediately pressed for details, and Vivian struggled to maintain her composure as the truth she had spent all evening suppressing finally slipped past her control. Margaret followed her onto the stage and told the room that the company would launch an independent investigation into its safety reporting and governance practices. She offered no details designed to humiliate her daughter publicly, but she confirmed clearly that leadership had failed to take important warnings seriously. The board convened an emergency session that same night, suspending Vivian from her role as chief executive pending the outcome of the investigation, while Bradley was terminated outright for document fraud and misuse of intellectual property that did not belong to him. Margaret did not reclaim permanent control of the company for herself. She agreed only to serve as interim chair until a new chief executive could be properly selected. Nathan was offered a seat at the head table once the announcements concluded, and he declined, choosing instead to return to the staff dining room to finish the meal that had been interrupted hours earlier. Derek, Diane, and 2 members of the board followed him there without a second thought. The very table Vivian had used to diminish Nathan had become the place where the company's recovery was actually being discussed, chair by folding chair. Vivian stood near the doorway and watched her mother, several board members, and the people who mattered most that night gathered around a table she had once considered beneath her notice. For the first time, she understood that she had never pushed Nathan away from power at all. She had only pushed herself away from the place where real power had quietly been forming the entire time. Margaret did not invite her daughter in right away, letting her stand there a moment longer, feeling the same isolation she had tried so carelessly to force onto Nathan earlier that night. Nathan glanced toward the doorway, saw Vivian standing there, and chose not to make her suffer for it. Instead, he simply pulled out an empty chair and waited to see whether she had the courage to walk through the door. Vivian stepped into the staff dining room without an assistant, a camera, or a title standing between her and the people she had spent the evening dismissing. She apologized to Nathan for using his role as a single father as leverage and for turning a simple meal with hard-working employees into something meant to shame him. Nathan did not forgive her instantly, and he made no effort to embarrass her further in front of the others watching. He told her plainly that an apology only meant something if the people she had dismissed noticed a real change. Once the night was finally over, her voice caught slightly as she said it, the practiced smoothness of every prior speech that night finally giving way to something plainer and less rehearsed. Renee did not rush to comfort her, and Marcus simply nodded once, the way a man does when an apology arrives a little late but is not, for that reason, worthless. Vivian turned to Renee and Marcus and admitted quietly that she had spent years treating her own staff as instruments of operation rather than as the people who understood the company better than anyone in a boardroom ever could. Margaret laid out the conditions under which her daughter might eventually return to a leadership position at Ashford Regency. She would need to step away from executive authority for at least 1 full year and work directly within the operational teams overseeing repairs at the affected properties. She would carry no executive title, no private office, and would answer instead to the engineering team and the local hotel managers she had once looked down upon without a second thought. It was not an easy forgiveness handed down out of convenience, but a path built to make her learn the business from the ground up the way her mother once had. Nathan signed a new agreement with Ashford Regency only after the board accepted every safety condition in full, agreeing to retain the original maintenance staff and formally protect the employees who had come forward with evidence. He did not sell his patents. Cole Systems Engineering remained independent, fairly compensated for the value it had always carried. 3 months later, the first renovated resort reopened to the public, meeting every safety standard Nathan had originally outlined, and not a single employee had lost a job in the process. The resort's lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and cedar, and sunlight fell across newly polished floors where, months earlier, tarps and exposed wiring had lined the halls. Guests moved freely through spaces that had been carefully rebuilt from the ground up, unaware of how close the entire property had once come to opening with the same hidden dangers Nathan had first flagged. Renee was promoted to oversee operational training across the company's properties, while Marcus became head of an independent safety oversight team, answering directly to the board rather than to any single executive. At the reopening ceremony, Nathan received a call from Mia, who asked when exactly everything had begun to change. He looked out at the simple dining table where staff and new leadership now sat together without separation, and answered that it had started the moment one woman with enough power finally chose to sit down, and everyone else in the room was finally forced to listen. Sunlight came through tall windows overlooking the water, catching the steam rising off mugs of coffee passed casually from hand to hand along the table. No one waiting to be served, no one standing apart. Somewhere down the row, Renee laughed at something Derek said, and Marcus leaned back in his chair, entirely at ease in a room that had once made him feel invisible. Nathan thought, watching it all unfold, that this was closer to what his wife had always believed a company should feel like, long before either of them had ever heard the name Ashford Regency. It was not the size of the building or the height of its ceilings that made a place worth trusting, but whether the people inside it were willing to sit down together when it actually mattered. The story closed on an image of Margaret pulling a chair beside Nathan once again, just as she had on the night of the gala. Except this time there was no head seat reserved for the powerful and no separate room set aside for everyone else. There was only one long table stretching the length of the room, with enough seats for anyone willing to tell the truth.